a lifeless body beneath the echo of church bells. What secrets hide in the tower? Welcome to Mystery Tales. I am your host, Gravemind. Tell me where you're tuning in. Your comments always bring these mysteries to life. Let's begin. The bells of St. Mary's Church rang out across the village of Chipping Cleghorn, their cheerful peal floating over thatched cottages, neatly kept gardens and the winding cobbled high street. It was the annual Harvest Festival, a much-anticipated event that drew together every inhabitant of the parish, be they humble gardener, prosperous shopkeeper, or titled Lady from the Hall. Tables had been laid out in the churchyard beneath the sprawling yew trees, laden with pies, jars of preserves, fresh loaves, and baskets of gleaming apples polished until they shone like jewels. Children darted between the benches, their laughter mixing with the rustle of hymn sheets as the choir rehearsed inside the church. Miss Jane Marple, seated a little apart beneath the shade of the lich gate, observed the lively comings and goings with her customary mild interest. To the casual eye she appeared merely an elderly spinster enjoying the sunshine, a ball of knitting wool resting in her lap. Yet her pale blue eyes, sharp as a robin's, noted every detail. Mrs. Price Ridley fussing over her lemon curd with undue agitation, young Tom Bartlett whispering rather urgently to the vicar's daughter, and Colonel Denham keeping a too watchful eye on his wife as she chatted, quite innocently, by the jam stall. All was as it ever was in Chipping Cleghorn, with its undercurrent of small rivalries, whispered gossip, and carefully preserved appearances. Miss Marple, who knew human nature as well as she knew her roses, reflected that nothing in the village was ever as harmless as it seemed. The festival reached its peak when the congregation was called into the cool stone church for the blessing of the harvest. The air inside was heavy with the scent of beeswax and flowers, the sunlight slanting in through stained glass to fall in jeweled pools upon the worn flagstones. At the back of the nave the old bell tower loomed, its wooden stair twisting upward into shadow. The service began, voices lifting in the hymn, "We plough the fields and scatter." It was at that moment, as the organ thundered and the children sang with shrill enthusiasm, that a sound not in the least holy rent the air, a dreadful cry. Echoing down from above, the congregation turned as one. A figure stumbled out from the tower door and collapsed onto the stone floor. It was Mr. Harold Pritchard, the church's long-time bell-ringer and a man of exacting habits. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with horror, his hands trembling as he pointed back into the gloom. There in the bell chamber, he gasped before falling senseless at the vicar's feet. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Colonel Denham barked something about fetching the constable, while Mrs. Price Ridley let out a dramatic shriek. Miss Marple did not move. Her needles clicked once, twice, and then stilled. She had seen the look in Pritchard's eyes, the unmistakable mark of someone who had witnessed something not merely shocking, but dreadful. When at last the braver souls ventured into the tower, they found the body of Mrs. Margaret Fletcher, the organist lying sprawled beneath the great bell rope. Her head was at an unnatural angle, her music score scattered like fallen leaves around her. The bells above, silent now, seemed to brood over the scene. Miss Marple, her expression one of quiet sorrow, folded her knitting and rose. She had been in many churches, in many villages, and she knew, though no one else yet did, that the peace of Chipping Cleghorn had just been broken by murder. The church emptied by degrees, not with the orderly dignity of a procession, but with the flutter and murmur of a disturbed dovecote. The vicar, pale and determined, shepherded people into the late afternoon light and told them very gently to go home, to pray, and to leave the matter to those whose burden it was. Few obeyed in spirit. Clusters formed at the lich gate and by the trestle tables, voices dropping only when Miss Marple passed by, which she did without hurry, her folded knitting tucked neatly under one arm. She paused to admire a basket of russets that had remained unbought, and without appearing to look took in faces. Grief was there, and the titillation of fear, and on 2 or 3 countenances something brisker, calculation. Mr. Harold Pritchard, having revived under Dr. Forbes's attentions, sat on a bench with a damp handkerchief laid across his brow. He was an orderly man, Pritchard, priding himself on the smooth running of the bells and on the stiffness of his collars. He spoke in a series of lean sentences as the village constable, Sergeant Barker, a square, resolute figure with honest boots, made careful notes. "I had gone up to set the stay, Sergeant. The little bell's stay. She's prone to slipping if one isn't watchful. I keep a rag tied there, bit of old linen, makes the grip easy. I'd scarcely set foot in the chamber when I saw her. At first I thought fainted, perhaps. But the angle, her neck—" He broke off, gulping, and ran the back of his hand over his mouth, smearing something light and powdery across his lip. Dr. Forbes dabbed the residue away with his own brisk handkerchief and murmured to him to take things slow. "It will be an accident," Mrs. Price Ridley declared loudly to anyone who wandered within her sphere. "Such dreadful staircases. No guardrail to speak of. It's a wonder it doesn't happen twice a year. The church committee will have to answer for it. Poor Margaret. Well, of course, she was always stubborn about sensible footwear." She looked down at her own stout lace-ups and then, with a little inward twitch of advantage, at the elegant kid shoes of Mrs. Denham, who stood a few paces off, silent, eyes lowered, hands turned inward in their gloves as though she might hide them if she pressed hard enough. Colonel Denham stamped about, rousing in himself the pleasant sensation of command. "No one to go up that tower," he boomed to Barker, though it was Barker's duty to say it, "until the proper men arrive from county. CID. Rope off the door, Barker." "I'll fetch some string." He strode purposefully for the jam stall, found twine beneath a gingham cloth, and returned with it as though he had requisitioned ammunition under fire. Mrs. Hartnell, keeper of the stall, protested that it was for tying jars, and the colonel told her it would be returned upon conclusion of official business, to which she responded with unexpected steel that she would prefer 6pence. From the shade of the yew, Miss Marple observed Colonel Denham's happy fussing, and thought of a boy she had known in St. Mary Mead, who would break a window to have the satisfaction of mending it. "Men do so love a barricade," she said to no one in particular, and then, as if the thought followed naturally, she added, "Such a pity about Mrs. Fletcher's wrists." "Her wrists?" Dr. Forbes turned, caught unawares. He was a youngish man with a reputation for bicycles and efficiency. "Always so delicately made," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "I remember thinking at Whitsun, when she turned the pages at the organ loft, that her glove had a small tear where a lady might catch a ring. Such little rents can grow with the least pull. It happens in the most unexpected moments." Dr. Forbes blinked, considered, and then nodded in a professional manner intended to hide that he had been made to think of something he had not. "Quite so, Miss Marple, quite so. You will let me see you home?" "Oh, thank you, no. I shall go by the green. There is always such excellent tea after an upset. People pour it very strong, they did." Within half an hour the Green Dragon had become an unofficial coroner's court, presided over by Mrs. Beamish, who moved between tables with a tray and the air of a judge tolerant of counsel. "Another part, of course. Milk first, dear. It settles the nerves." She dispensed cups, along with the satisfaction of being the first to hear and repeat what everyone was thinking. Tom Bartlett, the garage boy, sat with Lucy Grant, the vicar's daughter, at a corner table, their heads close, their voices lower than the rest. Tom was a handsome, anxious youth, whose forearms bore the permanent smudge of mechanics, and whose tongue, in excitement, had a habit of outrunning prudence. "She must have slipped," he said. "Those stairs up there, I've been up once, to oil the hatch. Slippery as anything." "If the bell was swinging—" "The bells weren't swinging," Lucy whispered. "Father won't say, but I heard Mr. Pritchard tell Sergeant Barker he had set the stay, whatever that means. They don't swing during the service. They are chimed." "How do you chime without swinging?" Tom frowned at his cup as though it might tell him. "With the rope," Lucy said, entirely unsure but certain of the comfort of knowledge. Miss Marple at the next table did not appear to hear. Her tea was indeed strong, the colour of good mahogany. She sweetened it as she always did with exactly one lump, and reflected that children, for they were children to her, though Lucy would bristle at the word, will always prefer a mechanical explanation. Adults do too often, unless vanity suggests a more interesting one. "Mark me," said Mr. Symes, the grocer, addressing the room over the rim of his cup. "There'll be something in the accounts. Organ fund, wasn't there? New pipes or some such. Those things cost. Money goes missing in the oddest ways when there's music involved. Remember the bandstand business at Up or Down? Artistic overspend, they called it. I call it fiddling." Mrs. Price Ridley, now established near the fireplace where she looked well as if framed, lifted an eyebrow. "My dear Mr. Symes, Mrs. Fletcher was incapable of fiddling. She was, if anything, scrupulous to a fault. Late husband?" Mrs. Beamish put the pot down with a clink. "Comfortably provided." "You surprise me, Mrs. Price Ridley. I had it she took in pupils for the income. Those scales of little Daphne Reeds didn't sound like charity to me." "That," Mrs. Price Ridley said, cool as a July cucumber, "is what one does in a village. It is not always about money." "Sometimes," said Colonel Denham, who had entered and found the exact centre of the room for his stance. "It is about morals." He tapped his stick. As though punctuating a sermon he was not quite qualified to give. "A lady alone is apt to form ill-judged friendships. I have observed young Bartlett here, standing beneath the organ loft more often than a young fellow has business to. No offence, Bartlett, but facts are facts." Tom flushed. Lucy drew in her breath, and Miss Marple thought, with a mild inward sigh, of a cockerel pecking at his own reflection. "The Colonel," she mused silently, "has been married a long time and finds the spectacle of other people's liberty most provoking." He carried a ladder in for the lanterns. "Colonel," Lucy said, uncharacteristically tart, "for the harvest display." "Quite right," Miss Marple murmured into her cup as if to the tea leaves. "Lanterns require ladders, and hands that do not shake." Mrs. Denham had come in behind her husband and taken a small table near the window. She removed her gloves with precise movements that spoke of practice, laying them side by side, smoothing each finger as though settling a restless child. The pale indentation where a wedding ring had been too tight in summer lingered on her skin. She looked from face to face and spoke to none. "Accident, morality, money," Sergeant Barker said, appearing in the doorway with a solemnity that silenced the room more effectively than any gavel. "Those are the words I have heard and written, and they are not the same as evidence. I must ask that talk of this sort be kept decent and quiet. There will be an inquest. The county men are on their way." "When?" Mrs. Price Ridley asked, with the air of a lady booking a tea-table. "Soon enough," said Barker, who disliked clocks when they were not his own. He took a step further in and nodded to Miss Marple with a respect he didn't extend to many. "You'll be careful going home, miss." "I always am, Sergeant," she said, and gathered her knitting as if her life depended upon the proper keeping of wool. On her way out, she paused to draw a fingertip lightly along the back of a chair near where Mr. Pritchard had earlier rested. One of those gentle, absent-minded gestures old ladies make when straightening what needs no straightening. Her finger came away with a trace of white, fine as flour. She looked at it thoughtfully, and then, without comment, brushed it against her palm. Outside, the sky had gone the grey of pewter, though the hedgerows still held their late September colour with defiance. Miss Marple walked the lane at an ambling pace. She had no desire to outwalk her thoughts. People, she reflected, are much like church bells. They can be set ringing by the slightest pull, and they make an excellent show of it. But there is always a hand on the rope, and the hand is not always the one they would have you see. Behind her the Green Dragon resumed its normal hum, but under it ran a quicker current. Those who had known Mrs. Fletcher remembered things, a quarrel overheard, nothing really about a hymn tune, A letter delivered by the early post, in a foreign envelope, some said. The way she had been speaking lately of Exeter, not the law firm now, but a niece there or a cousin. The fact that she had started, only last week, to bring her own cushion to the organ bench, like a lady guarding her place. Small observations each offered as a novelty. To Miss Marple they felt like the everyday crumbs that lead to kitchens, rather than treasure. And yet, crumbs could show the path a mouse took, and that was often the more instructive trail. At the vicarage gate, she met Lucy, who had slipped away from Tom and from the talk which, brave as she was, had begun to fray her composure. "Miss Marple," she said, do you think it was an accident? Father says we mustn't speculate, but—" "My dear," Miss Marple said, patting the girl's hand as one might comfort a child after a nightmare, "I think we must not decide too soon what would be most comfortable to believe. I have always found," and here her eyes took on a mild brightness, "that when a thing looks like an accident, it is sometimes, though not always, because someone has taken pains to make it so." Lucy swallowed. "But who would hurt Mrs. Fletcher?" "That," Miss Marple said, "is precisely the thing the county men will wish to know. And we shall let them wish it, shall we not?" She smiled, a small kind curve of the mouth that did not quite reach the thoughtful set of her eyes. "You must tell your father I shall bring him some quince jelly. Quince is very soothing after disturbances." Lucy's laugh was real and grateful. She went up the path to the vicarage, and Miss Marple continued home thinking of wrists and ropes, and the way powder clings to the skin when one is flurried. She did not hurry. It was not in her nature to run at a problem. One sits and one knits, and one remembers a housemaid in 1908 who powdered the stair to see where the cat went at night. The paw marks had told no lies. People's marks seldom did, if one only remembered to look for them. Morning came in Chipping Cleghorn with a soft mist hanging low over the hedgerows, though the sun soon burned it away, revealing a day bright and clear as if the earth itself had no memory of yesterday's horror. But memory was alive in every human breast, and the first sound Miss Marple heard upon drawing back her curtains was the sharp clatter of Mrs. Harper's milk bottles on the step below, followed by the hushed but eager voices of neighbours conferring in the lane. The village had awoken not to its customary talk of weather and gardens, but to speculation, each person convinced of their own version of events, and each version bearing the unmistakable stamp of personal prejudice. At the grocer's, Mr. Symes was telling anyone who would listen that Mrs. Fletcher's death was bound to have been an accident, a woman too fond of the dramatic, never steady in her ways. In the same breath, however, he hinted that something in her accounts might come to light, some matter of missing shillings. At the post office, Miss Hartnell assured her sister that the organist had been meddling in matters she ought not to, and that the truth would soon enough be revealed by letters. There were always letters, after all, and Miss Hartnell prided herself on knowing which envelopes passed over her counter, and when. And at the Green Dragon, where Mrs. Beamish poured tea stronger than usual, Colonel Denham expounded at length on the dangers of moral laxity, hinting broadly that Mrs. Fletcher had been altogether too free in her companionship with younger men. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat by her window with her knitting, listening rather than speaking. The voices of the village carried easily across the hedge, and she knew from long experience that the first outpouring of conjecture after a death was often the most revealing, not of the truth of the matter, but of people's hearts. To accuse another, even obliquely, is to show something of oneself. She tucked that thought away, as she tucked her ball of yarn into her knitting bag and set out for the vicarage. It was not curiosity, she told herself gently, but neighbourly duty. Mr. Clement would surely be troubled, and it was only right to offer help. The vicar received her in his study, looking 10 years older than he had the day before. "A dreadful business, Miss Marple," he said, rubbing his forehead. "I scarcely slept a wink. Poor Margaret, so devoted to the church. It is unbearable to think of her life ending in such a fashion." Miss Marple murmured her agreement, her eyes wandering gently about the room. On the desk lay a sheet of paper, hastily blotted with the heading of the diocesan office. Mr. Clement noticed her glance and pushed the paper aside, perhaps more quickly than he realized. "The police will wish to speak with all of us," he went on, "though I dare say there is little we can say. She had no enemies here." Miss Marple folded her hands. "One so seldom recognizes an enemy until after the fact, Mr. Clement. In villages especially, I find dislike is often disguised as civility." She gave him a kindly smile that robbed the words of sharpness. "But no doubt the police will discover what there is to discover." Her words proved apt. By mid-morning, Inspector Graves had arrived from the county town, a lean grey man with the look of one accustomed to reading the less savoury aspects of human nature in the faces of his fellow creatures. Sergeant Barker accompanied him with an air of pride, as though bringing the inspector to Chipping Cleghorn were a personal accomplishment. Graves took statements with quiet patience, listening far more than he spoke, though once or twice Miss Marple noticed his eyes flicker with interest at some trivial aside. When it came her turn, she was careful to describe only what she had seen and heard: the cry from the tower, Mr. Pritchard's collapse, the position of Mrs. Fletcher's body. She did not mention the powdery trace she had brushed from the chair, nor her musings on gloves and rents. Such observations, she knew, were better kept until the moment they would be truly useful. But she did add in her mildest tone that Mrs. Fletcher had appeared somewhat preoccupied in recent weeks. She often paused at the lane to Exeter, as though in thought, she said. It may mean nothing at all, of course. Ladies are fond of recollection. The inspector made a note, his pencil moving briskly. "Thank you, Miss Marple. We shall inquire further." By afternoon the village had settled into a rhythm of speculation. Some declared it an accident, others whispered of secrets, and still others relished the drama of suggesting foul play. What united them all was the conviction that they themselves had seen something telling. Mrs. Price Ridley insisted she had noticed Mrs. Fletcher's gown hem was torn, proof in her mind of a fall. Tom Bartlett swore that Mrs. Fletcher had been speaking with a stranger near the garage the previous week, a stranger no one else admitted to having seen. And Mrs. Denham, when pressed by her husband to add her word, merely said quietly that she had heard the organist practicing a different hymn than was scheduled for the harvest festival. Jesu! Grant me this, I pray. A funeral hymn, in fact. That detail spread like wildfire, so that by evening the entire village was murmuring that Mrs. Fletcher had somehow foreseen her own death. Miss Marple, walking home from the post office with a small packet of wool, thought how very human it was to imbue a chance choice with solemn meaning after the fact. She remembered, too, how Mrs. Denham's hands had trembled very slightly as she smoothed her gloves. Trembling could be grief, or it could be something else. As twilight fell, the bells of St. Mary's were silent. The tower loomed dark against the sky, its door bound with Colonel Denham's string, a feeble barrier but a symbol all the same. Miss Marple paused at her gate, looking back once before going inside. The village was restless, as villages always were when tragedy struck, but beneath the surface hum of gossip, she felt something more deliberate stirring, a hidden current of truth waiting to be uncovered. And she thought with the quiet certainty of long experience that before this was finished, more secrets than one would be drawn into the light. Inspector Graves spent the following morning at the church, his grey overcoat buttoned tight against the brisk air that swept through the tower. The villagers who lingered in the churchyard under various pretenses of tidying or delivering flowers watched him with eager eyes. He was joined by Sergeant Barker, who climbed the winding stair with a lantern, while Graves examined the floor below, pausing now and then to brush at the stone with his gloved hand. Word soon spread that the inspector had taken great interest in the bell rope itself, which lay coiled upon the floor as though discarded. Miss Marple, passing on her way to the grocer's, was drawn into conversation with Mrs. Beamish, who leaned heavily on her broom at the lich gate. "He's looking at the rope, Miss Marple," she confided in a stage whisper, as if it held the secret itself. "Barker said they'll take it away to town for examination. Can you imagine? Her church rope in a police station. What would the bishop say?" She shook her head with relish. Miss Marple only smiled, her eyes on the cluster of parishioners near the porch. Mr. Pritchard stood there, his face still pale from shock, while Colonel Denham expounded to all who would listen that foul play was a certainty. Lucy Grant lingered nearby, quiet and thoughtful, while Tom Bartlett fidgeted at her side, glancing at the inspector with restless curiosity. Mrs. Denham was present too, standing a little apart, her expression as composed as ever. But her fingers, bare now of gloves, twisted and untwisted a handkerchief with unconscious motion. Graves descended at last, his face giving little away. He ordered the tower locked and the key kept in his possession. "This is no simple accident," he told the vicar gravely, though half the village heard the words. "We shall proceed on that understanding." A ripple of unease travelled through the crowd. For the first time it was no longer gossip, but official fact. Margaret Fletcher had been murdered. The news spread quickly. At the Green Dragon, cups clinked and tongues wagged. Mrs. Price Ridley declared that she had always known something was amiss with Margaret Fletcher's manner, too self-possessed by half and certainly given to secrets. Mr. Symes reminded everyone of his theory about missing church funds, insisting that the inspector's interest in the rope was merely a blind to keep the true matter hidden until the accounts were checked. Young Tom Bartlett muttered that perhaps a stranger had been involved, someone passing through, and Lucy pressed his hand in quiet warning to speak no further. Miss Marple, sitting in her accustomed seat by the window, did not argue with any of them. She only stirred her tea slowly and looked thoughtful. She recalled how Mrs. Fletcher had begun carrying her own cushion to the organ loft, an odd detail perhaps, yet oddities often pointed to truth. She also remembered the faint powder on Pritchard's lip and the trace she herself had found on the chair. Those were not the marks of accident. Inspector Graves began his round of questioning that afternoon. He spoke first with Mr. Pritchard, who repeated his story with weary exactitude, though Miss Marple, who happened to be in the churchyard arranging a few chrysanthemums, noticed that his eyes flickered nervously when asked about the condition of the ropes. Graves next summoned Colonel and Mrs. Denham. The Colonel answered in a booming voice, insisting that lax morals lay at the root of the matter. Mrs. Denham said very little, though once when Graves asked whether she had spoken with Mrs. Fletcher recently, her eyes filled with sudden tears. She turned aside quickly, but Miss Marple, whose sight was keen, saw how the handkerchief in her hands was crumpled nearly to shreds. Lucy Grant was questioned too, her young face earnest. She told the inspector that Mrs. Fletcher had seemed distracted of late, often pausing in her playing as though listening for something. "She was kind to me, though," Lucy added softly. "She gave me a book of hymns only last week. She said I ought to keep it safe, as it might be useful one day." Graves noted this with interest. As the inspector departed, Miss Marple caught his eye and gave a small, courteous nod. She would never intrude directly, but she knew that even the keenest professional eye sometimes missed the threads that bound people together. That, after all, was not in the evidence but in the heart. That evening the village gathered once more at the Green Dragon, unable to resist the magnet of shared speculation. The fire crackled, shadows danced on the low-beam ceiling, and the talk was louder, more reckless now that murder had been named. Some said Pritchard must have quarrelled with Mrs. Fletcher about the bells. Others hinted at jealousy, though none could say of whom or what. A few whispered that Mrs. Denham's tears spoke of knowledge too heavy to bear. Miss Marple, seated with her knitting in hand, listened without interruption. She remembered a maid in St. Mary Mead long ago, who had feigned grief to hide her relief when another took the blame for her misdeeds. People, she thought, often cried not from sorrow but from fear, And she considered too how quickly villagers reached for scandal when the truth might be far simpler or far darker. As she rose to leave, she paused at the hearth, where Sergeant Barker sat with a tankard. "It is all very troubling, Sergeant," she said mildly, "but I do wonder. Had Mrs. Fletcher any reason to climb the tower during the service? It seems such an unusual place for a lady to go at that time." Barker frowned, scratching his head. "That's just it, Miss Marple. She had no reason at all. And yet there she was." Miss Marple nodded, her expression gentle. "Yes, that is what troubles me also." She smiled faintly, as though the matter were no more than a misplaced hymn book, and went on her way. But her thoughts were sharp and steady. Someone had led Mrs. Fletcher into that tower, or else lured her there by some means she trusted, and that someone was not a stranger. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple set her knitting aside and took up a small notebook in which she jotted down the names of those most closely connected with the church: Harold Pritchard, the Denhams, Lucy Grant, Tom Bartlett, and of course the vicar himself. She added a few brief notes beside each, no more than a word or two, pride or fears, ambition or grief, her shorthand for the qualities she had glimpsed. Closing the book, she folded her hands in her lap. The pattern was not yet clear, but she had seen enough in human nature to know that it would emerge. And when it did, it would be as unmistakable as a dropped stitch in her knitting, impossible to hide no matter how elaborate the design. The village slept uneasily that night, with shutters closed tight and doors bolted, though no one could say from what they were protecting themselves. In the silence, the bell tower stood dark against the moon, its rope removed, its door barred. But Miss Marple, lying awake, thought of how very easy it was to make a thing appear ordinary until one looked closely, and how very often it was the smallest detail, the powder on a chair, the choice of a hymn, the tremble of a hand, that revealed the truth behind a mask. The following morning dawned with a sky the colour of pewter, a low mist clinging stubbornly to the hedgerows, as though the village itself wished to conceal what had happened within its boundaries. Yet concealment was impossible, for by breakfast time every household in Chipping Cleghorn knew that Inspector Graves had ordered a post-mortem. Such a word, clinical, precise, was whispered with relish by Mrs. Price Ridley at her gate, with distaste by Mrs. Denham as she poured her husband's tea, and with open curiosity by young Tom Bartlett as he adjusted a carburettor at the garage. Even the postman, trudging his rounds, delivered more gossip than letters. Miss Marple, seated by her hearth with her teapot close at hand, reflected on the unease that lay beneath these exchanges. The village had taken comfort in the first hours from thinking Mrs. Fletcher's death an accident. Now that murder had been pronounced, comfort had fled, leaving behind a mixture of fear and self-interest. Each was considering what the inspector might ask, what he might discover, and how it might reflect upon themselves. Miss Marple knew well that in such moments truth was often betrayed not by grand confessions, but by small inconsistencies. Inspector Graves, for his part, began calling upon households in turn. He came first to the Denhams' residence, where Colonel Denham spoke loudly and at length of his military service, his sense of duty, and his horror at wickedness of every kind. He insisted that he and his wife had been seated together throughout the service and had neither seen nor spoken to Mrs. Fletcher that morning. His wife confirmed this in a soft voice, her eyes lowered, though Graves observed the tightness with which she clasped her hands, as though to still their trembling. Later, in the village street, Mrs. Price Ridley intercepted Graves to offer her own observations. "It is only my duty, Inspector," she said, "to mention that Margaret Fletcher was never, how shall I put it, entirely candid about her affairs. Why, only a fortnight ago I saw her receiving a letter from abroad. Italy, I believe. At her age one wonders what business she had with foreign correspondence." Graves noted this without comment, though his eyes narrowed slightly. Letters, especially foreign ones, had a way of stirring suspicion far out of proportion to their contents. At the Green Dragon that evening, the talk was darker still. Mr. Symes declared that the organist had quarrelled with Mr. Pritchard about the order of hymns, a detail he claimed to have heard from a reliable source. Tom Bartlett, half out of bravado and half from nervousness, said he had once seen Mrs. Fletcher in heated discussion with the Colonel, though he could not recall the subject. Lucy Grant reproved him gently, urging him not to spread unkind stories, but her cheeks were pale and her hands restless upon her teacup. Miss Marple, knitting serenely by the fire, watched them all with quiet attention. The following day, Inspector Graves convened a brief gathering in the vestry, summoning those most closely connected with the church. Miss Marple, though not formally required, found herself there at the vicar's invitation, ostensibly to provide comfort to Lucy. The vestry was a small, wood-panelled room that smelled of polish and candle wax, and it was here that Graves announced the first clear result of the examination. Mrs. Fletcher did not die from a fall, he said plainly. She was strangled. The marks about her neck are conclusive. Moreover, traces of a fine powder were found on her skin and on the bell rope itself. It is likely that powder was used to improve grip. Whoever killed her was deliberate and careful. A silence followed, broken only by Mrs. Price Ridley's sharp intake of breath. Colonel Denham muttered something about foreign methods, while Mrs. Denham closed her eyes briefly, as if in prayer. Mr. Pritchard, however, shifted uneasily in his chair, his fingers twitching at his collar. Miss Marple, watching him, thought again of the powder she had once brushed from a chair, and the smudge that had lingered upon his lip. Graves's gaze swept the room. "I will ask each of you," he said, "to consider carefully what you saw or heard on the day in question. Even the smallest detail may be of value. And I warn you, the guilty party will find it impossible to hide forever. Truth, in my experience, comes to light, whether one wills it or not." As the villagers departed, their faces pale and drawn, Miss Marple lingered behind a moment, ostensibly to gather Lucy's hymn-book from a pew. "It is remarkable, Inspector," she said in her mild, reflective tone, "how powder clings. I remember a housemaid many years ago who dusted the banisters with French chalk. One could always see afterwards exactly which member of the household had touched them. People seldom realize how their habits betray them." Graves looked at her keenly, but Miss Marple only smiled and murmured something about the lateness of the hour. She departed with Lucy, leaving the inspector thoughtful in the dim vestry. That evening, as she sat in her parlour, Miss Marple arranged her notes once more. The powder was important, of that she was certain. But so too were the foreign letters, the cushion brought to the organ loft and the curious choice of hymn. Each was a thread, and the pattern, though faint, was beginning to take shape. She recalled Mrs. Denham's trembling hands, the Colonel's bluster, Pritchard's unease, and young Tom's too ready tongue. The truth, she knew, was concealed among them, as surely as a dropped stitch in her knitting. And like a dropped stitch, it could not remain hidden forever. Outside, the bell tower loomed dark and silent against the night sky. The village slept uneasily once more, each household haunted by suspicion. Miss Marple, however, sat awake a little longer, her knitting needles clicking softly in the stillness, her mind as precise and patient as the pattern growing beneath her hands. The days that followed carried with them a peculiar hush, as though the village itself were listening. People moved about their errands more quietly, their conversations cut short whenever a shadow fell across the doorway. Yet beneath the hush was a current of restless speculation, stronger than before, fueled now by the inspector's pronouncement that Mrs. Fletcher had been strangled. It was no longer merely dreadful. It was deliberate, and deliberate crimes demanded deliberate explanations. Each villager sought to supply one. Colonel Denham was more than willing to explain the matter to anyone within earshot. "Mark my words," he said at the post office, "this will be the work of some outsider. Vagrants, rogues, fellows who drift from place to place. Strangulation is not the method of an Englishman. It smacks of the continent." I said as much to the inspector, though he insists on badgering decent folk here in the village." He puffed out his chest as he spoke, though his wife, standing at his side with downcast eyes, seemed to shrink further into her gloves. By contrast, Mrs. Price Ridley declared with absolute certainty that the deed must have sprung from jealousy. She was not young, of course, but Margaret Fletcher always made an effort with her appearance. One never knows what foolishness men will get into their heads, even men one might think immune. I should not be surprised if some rivalry over affections were at the root of this tragedy. She did not name names, but her pointed glance towards Tom Bartlett, who happened to be passing with a parcel of oil rags, left little doubt of her meaning. Tom, red to the roots of his hair, strode on without reply. Yet later that afternoon he was seen with Lucy Grant near the churchyard, speaking in an urgent whisper. "They'll have me for it, Lucy," he said, his hands twisting at his cap. "The Colonel all but accused me, and Mrs. Price Ridley too. I'd never have touched her, you know that." Lucy placed a hand on his arm and begged him to be calm, but her eyes betrayed her fear. She was young, and she knew well how quickly suspicion could become conviction. Inspector Graves, methodical in his approach, spent the day examining Mrs. Fletcher's personal effects. Their small writing desk had been removed from her cottage to the police station, and it was there that he discovered several letters tied with a faded ribbon. Some were ordinary notes from parishioners, but among them lay envelopes postmarked from Florence. The handwriting was neat and masculine, though the contents revealed little beyond affectionate inquiries after her health and references to music. Graves showed them to Dr. Forbes, who admitted he had never heard her speak of any foreign acquaintance. The inspector made careful note of the dates, the most recent being only a week before her death. Word of the discovery leaked, as such things always do. By evening, the Green Dragon was alive with speculation about Italian admirers, secret correspondence and scandal long concealed. Mrs. Beamish, pouring out cups of strong tea with more clatter than usual, declared it a dreadful warning of the dangers of foreign entanglements. Mr. Symes, seizing the opportunity, reminded all present that he had mentioned money from the very first. "Mark me," he said, "there'll be a legacy, a codicil, something of that sort. People don't get letters from abroad unless there's property in question." Miss Marple, seated as ever in her accustomed place, listened with the same mild interest she might bestow upon the habits of sparrows. She had herself observed, during many years in St. Mary Mead, how quickly gossip turned letters into legacies, and legacies into motives for murder. But she thought too of Mrs. Fletcher's cushion, such a curious detail easily overlooked. Why carry a cushion to the organ loft? Not for comfort, surely, for she had played there many years without one. It was more likely a hiding place, perhaps for the very letters the inspector now held. If so, then the organist had feared discovery, and fear, Miss Marple reflected, often walked hand in hand with danger. The following morning, Inspector Graves called again at the vicarage. He wished to know whether Mrs. Fletcher had confided in the vicar or his family. Mr. Clement admitted she had seemed troubled, but had said little beyond vague remarks about past mistakes and new beginnings. Lucy mentioned the hymn book Mrs. Fletcher had given her, but blushed when she realized how trivial it sounded. Graves asked to see it, and Lucy fetched it from her room. He turned the pages slowly, pausing when a folded slip of paper fell out. It contained nothing more than a list of hymns, some marked with faint crosses, but the inspector slipped it into his pocket all the same. Miss Marple, who had come with a small jar of quince jelly for the vicar's wife, watched this exchange with quiet satisfaction. She had not expected the hymn book to be empty. People who choose to hide things seldom select a place without intent. What those marks meant, however, would require thought. She resolved to copy the list later, if opportunity allowed. That afternoon she encountered Mrs. Denham walking alone along the lane. The younger woman started at the sound of footsteps and turned, her face pale. "Miss Marple," she said quickly, "I beg you, do you think they will find who did it?" The inspector presses my husband with questions, but he knows nothing. Truly he does not. "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "I'm sure Inspector Graves is only doing his duty, but it is often a mistake to answer for others. One never quite knows the depths of another's heart, not even in marriage. I remember a case long ago of a gardener's wife in our village. She would have sworn to her husband's honesty. Yet it transpired he had been selling bulbs from the churchyard on the sly for years." Mrs. Denham gave a faint cry, half protest, half despair, and turned away. Miss Marple watched her go, noting the rigid set of her shoulders, the way her gloved hands clenched at her sides. It was not the behavior of a woman entirely at ease. By evening the mist had returned, shrouding the cottages in a damp veil. Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting calmly while her mind moved over the day's events. The letters from Florence, the cushion, the marked hymns, the Denham's unease, Pritchard's powder-stained hands, all were pieces of a pattern that was slowly, steadily emerging. And though the inspector searched for evidence in desks and hymnals, Miss Marple searched in human behavior, in the trembling of hands, in the sharpness of words, in the way guilt so often betrayed itself when least intended. She set down her knitting at last and folded it neatly in her lap. Murder, she reflected, was never as complicated as people liked to believe. It was rooted always in the ordinary failings of human nature: greed, jealousy, fear, pride. And somewhere in Chipping Cleghorn, someone was living with the weight of such a failing. It would not be long before the weight grew too heavy to carry unseen. The mist did not lift the next day, but hung heavy over the village, muffling sound and blurring the edges of familiar landmarks, until even the bell tower seemed a brooding phantom in the grey air. Inspector Graves took advantage of the gloom to continue his work with grim efficiency, summoning villagers one by one to the vestry for further questioning. His presence in the village had already begun to wear upon tempers. Polite faces were stretched thin, and more than one voice was raised too sharply at small provocations. Suspicion, like the mist, had seeped into every crevice. Harold Pritchard was among the first to be called. He came reluctantly, his collar damp from the fog, and sat stiffly opposite the inspector. He repeated again the story of finding Mrs. Fletcher, but under the inspector's steady gaze his account wavered. When Graves asked about the powder on the ropes, Pritchard grew flustered. "Chalk, sir, common chalk. One always dusts the ropes for grip. Nothing strange in that." Yet his hand strayed to his mouth as he spoke, unconsciously brushing at his lip as though remembering the smudge Miss Marple had once noticed. The inspector dismissed him with a curt nod, but his eyes followed the man out, calculating. Later that morning Miss Marple ventured into the village to collect a parcel of wool from the post office. She found Mrs. Price Ridley already there, holding forth to anyone who would listen. Foreign letters, powder, hymn lists. It is all very well for the inspector to chase such things, but the truth is simpler. Margaret Fletcher was an ambitious woman, and ambition always leads to ruin. She fancied herself superior to us, with her music and her airs. Well, pride goes before a fall, or in this case, strangulation. She said the last word with a shudder that seemed half pleasure. Miss Marple accepted her parcel quietly, reflecting as she walked away that Mrs. Price Ridley's eagerness to supply explanations said far more about herself than about the crime. That afternoon brought a new ripple of unease. Tom Bartlett, returning from a delivery in the next village, was stopped on the lane by Sergeant Barker. In his bag the sergeant discovered a length of cord, coiled neatly and still dusted with a faint trace of powder. Tom stammered that it was nothing more than a rope used in his work at the garage for lifting engines, but the sergeant took it into custody all the same. By the time the news reached the Green Dragon, it had grown into a certainty that Tom had been found with the murder rope itself. Mrs. Beamish served tea with a face full of tragedy, while Mr. Symes declared that he had always suspected the boy's hot temper. Lucy, pale with distress, slipped away before the gossip grew too vicious. Miss Marple, who had been quietly sipping her tea, thought of Lucy's loyalty of Tom's restless energy, and of how easily youth became the scapegoat for sins it had not committed. She remembered a boy in her own village years ago, accused of theft when the true culprit had been a respected farmer. Youth bore suspicion like a badge, while older faces often passed unexamined. She resolved to keep watch more closely than ever. Inspector Graves, meanwhile, was not satisfied with the cord alone. He summoned Tom and Lucy to the vestry, questioning them with stern impartiality. Tom swore passionately that he had never touched Mrs. Fletcher, that he had scarcely spoken to her except to carry the lanterns for the harvest display. Lucy supported him, her voice trembling but resolute. Graves listened, weighing every word, but dismissed them with no promise. Outside the vestry, Lucy clutched Tom's hand, whispering that all would be well, though her eyes betrayed her doubt. Miss Marple learned of this from the vicar's wife, who confided her worries over tea. "The inspector is thorough, Jane, but sometimes I think thoroughness blinds men to what is right before them. Poor Lucy is near to tears and Tom is beside himself, yet I cannot believe they had any part in it. They are young, yes, and impulsive, but not wicked." Miss Marple patted her friend's hand gently. "No, my dear. Wickedness is seldom the province of youth. It is more often found in those who have learned too well the ways of concealment. And concealment, I fear, is at the heart of this matter." That evening brought another revelation. Dr. Forbes, who had been examining Mrs. Fletcher's belongings at the inspector's request, discovered a small key hidden in the hem of the cushion she had carried to the organ loft. The stitching had been clumsy, hurried as though done in secret. When the key was tried at her cottage, it opened a locked drawer in her writing desk. Inside lay several documents, letters from Florence more intimate than the others, and a bank book showing recent withdrawals of considerable sums. The inspector, presenting this evidence at the Green Dragon, where half the village had gathered, declared that Mrs. Fletcher had been involved in some matter, yet to be explained, perhaps blackmail, perhaps fraud. The sums were too large for simple expenses. At this, the room erupted in murmurs. Mrs. Price Ridley shook her head knowingly. Mr. Symes muttered about money again, and Colonel Denham declared it a disgrace to the parish. Mrs. Denham sat silent, her eyes fixed on the fire, her handkerchief crumpled in her lap. Miss Marple, watching her, thought of how silence often spoke louder than words. She remembered, too, the marks in the hymn book, some hymns crossed, others not. She had copied the list discreetly, and now she considered what those marks might mean. Was it a code, a reminder, or something more subtle, connected to the organ music itself? She thought of Mrs. Fletcher practicing the funeral hymn, of her distracted pauses, of her sudden gift to Lucy. There was a meaning in it, if only one looked with the right eyes. As she walked home through the mist, Miss Marple turned these thoughts over, with the patience of one accustomed to patterns. Powder on the ropes, letters from abroad, money withdrawn, a hidden key, a cushion, a hymn book. Each piece lay upon the table of her mind, waiting to be fitted together. The inspector sought answers in documents and sums, but she sought them in hearts and hands. She remembered Mrs. Denham's trembling, Pritchard's unease, the Colonel's bluster, Tom's fear, Lucy's loyalty. Each was true to human nature, and human nature was always, in the end, the surest evidence of all. In her parlour, with the fire burning low, Miss Marple resumed her knitting. Her needles clicked softly in the stillness, as she reflected that murder was never a matter of rope or powder alone. It was a matter of choice, of desire, of weakness exploited, and strength misused. Somewhere in Chipping Cleghorn someone had chosen to kill, and that choice, however carefully concealed, would not remain hidden forever. The fog lingered still, but by morning the atmosphere in Chipping Cleghorn had grown taut with expectation. Inspector Graves had not declared an arrest, yet his presence moved like a shadow through the village. Each time he entered a cottage or stopped a villager on the street, curtains twitched, whispers flared, and eyes turned away in guilty haste. For all their gossip and speculation, no one wanted the inspector's scrutiny fixed too long upon them. Miss Marple, stepping quietly into the churchyard with a posy of late chrysanthemums, saw Harold Pritchard pacing near the tower. His step was jerky, impatient, and his face bore the strain of sleepless nights. When she greeted him, he started violently, then tried to cover it with a bow that was too abrupt to be natural. He muttered about the bells being silent too long, how the ropes would spoil without use, and how the festival lanterns had been left untidied in the loft. He spoke as if to justify his presence, though no accusation had been made. Miss Marple listened, nodded sympathetically, and remarked only that it was difficult when one's routine was disrupted. She watched his hands as he spoke. They twitched constantly, as though grasping at some rope that was not there. Later in the High Street, Colonel Denham was once again declaiming before a small gathering. He insisted that this business of foreign letters proved what he had said all along, that the woman had been entangled in some un-English intrigue. "And mark my words," he thundered, "when women meddle with matters beyond their sphere, tragedy follows. My wife, God bless her, knows her place. She has never corresponded with anyone from abroad." He said it with such force that several villagers exchanged uneasy glances, for Mrs. Denham, standing meekly beside him, had turned pale and looked away. Inspector Graves spent the afternoon at Mrs. Fletcher's cottage, going through her documents with painstaking care. Miss Marple, passing by, noted the curtains drawn tight, though a lamp glowed within. When he emerged at last, his face was grim. That evening at the Green Dragon, he disclosed that Mrs. Fletcher had withdrawn a substantial sum from her bank in Exeter, only days before her death. The money, however, was nowhere to be found. "Someone knew of it," Graves declared, "and someone killed to obtain it. For until we discover who profited, none of you are free from suspicion." The words fell heavily on the room. Mrs. Price Ridley gasped and crossed herself. Mr. Symes muttered darkly about youth and motor cars, and Mrs. Beamish declared that greed was the root of all evil. Tom Bartlett, already burdened by suspicion over the cord, flushed angrily and rose as though to leave, but Lucy caught his arm and begged him to sit. His face was set in stubborn lines, though his eyes betrayed fear. Miss Marple, quietly sipping her tea, observed how Lucy's hand trembled against his sleeve. Loyalty could be as revealing as guilt. The following day, Inspector Graves called the Denhams to the vestry once more. Colonel Denham blustered loudly about the indignity, proclaiming his loyalty to Crown and country. But Mrs. Denham spoke little, her voice barely audible. Graves pressed her gently about her acquaintance with Mrs. Fletcher, whether she had noticed any change in her manner, or had heard any talk of money. At this, Mrs. Denham faltered, then whispered that Mrs. Fletcher had spoken of starting afresh, of leaving Chipping Cleghorn, of settling accounts once and for all. "She seemed frightened," Mrs. Denham said, "as though something weighed upon her." Colonel Denham cut her short with a glare, declaring that his wife's nerves made her fanciful. Yet Miss Marple, who sat quietly knitting at the back of the vestry, noted the flicker of relief in Mrs. Denham's eyes when she ceased speaking. That evening, as Miss Marple walked home beneath the deepening fog, she pondered the curious mixture of fear and secrecy that hung about the Denham household. She recalled Mrs. Fletcher's hymn book, with certain hymns marked by faint crosses. One in particular stood out to her memory. "Jesu, grant me this, I pray," a hymn of resignation, of endings. Why mark that one? Was it a signal, a reminder, or merely the reflection of a troubled mind? The following morning brought a fresh shock. Sergeant Barker arrived breathless at the Green Dragon to report that a portion of the missing money had been found. It was discovered hidden beneath a loose stone in the bell tower floor, wrapped in a handkerchief, embroidered with the initials MF. At once the room erupted with speculation. Some said Mrs. Fletcher had concealed it there herself, intending to retrieve it later. Others whispered that the murderer had hidden it in haste, intending to return. Inspector Graves, however, was grim. "The money explains motive," he said, "but it does not explain the method. Powder on the rope, marks on the neck. These are not the signs of sudden theft. They are deliberate, and they point to someone with knowledge of the tower. All eyes turned to Harold Pritchard, who had gone ashen when the inspector spoke. He stammered that he had never touched the money, that he had found the tower empty save for Mrs. Fletcher's body. But his protests rang hollow, and mutters of bell ringer and powder passed from lip to lip. Tom Bartlett seized on the moment to declare that perhaps now people would see who truly had reason for suspicion. But his words only deepened the unease. Miss Marple, who had sat quietly throughout, observed the scene with her usual calm. She thought of how quickly suspicion shifted, like a weather vane in the wind, and how easily a village could unite against one of its own. Yet she knew better than to be swept along. She had seen Pritchard's unease, yes, but she had also seen Mrs. Denham's trembling hands, the Colonel's bluster, Tom's fear, Lucy's pale determination, and the inspector's relentless pursuit of money. Each told a story, but not all were true. That night, alone by her fire, Miss Marple laid her knitting aside and opened her small notebook once more. She wrote down the words powder, habitual, money, motive, hymns, message, cushion, key. Then beneath she added a new line, fear, Mrs. Denham, anger, Colonel, eagerness, Price, Ridley, pride, Pritchard, loyalty, Lucy, recklessness, Tom. She studied the list, her lips pursed in thought. The pattern was clearer now, though not yet complete. She reflected that in human nature, as in knitting, the dropped stitch was always there if one knew where to look. It was only a matter of time before it revealed itself beyond denial. The mist pressed against her windows, thick and unyielding, but Miss Marple's eyes were bright. The truth, she felt certain, was close at hand, hovering just beyond reach. And when it came into view it would not surprise her, for she had long since learned that the most dangerous secrets were not those hidden in foreign letters or bank ledgers, but those written quietly in the trembling of a hand, the flush of a cheek, the silence of a wife too fearful to speak. The fog thinned at last, though the damp seemed to cling to the cottages like a stubborn memory. By the time the sun broke through, Inspector Graves had already decided on his next course. He summoned the principal figures of the village to the vestry once more: Pritchard, the Denhams, Tom Bartlett, Lucy, and Mr. Clement. Miss Marple, though not invited, arrived with her knitting bag, and a smile so natural that the inspector could hardly object. Graves began with the discovery of the money in the bell tower. His voice was steady, but there was a weight behind the words that set the group on edge. This was not the act of a stranger, he said firmly. It was someone with knowledge of this place, someone who could move within these walls without question. I intend to find out who that was. Harold Pritchard flushed scarlet, his fingers plucking nervously at his coat. You don't think... Surely not me, Inspector. I've rung those bells for 20 years. If I'd wanted money, I wouldn't have hidden it in a place I know better than anyone. That'd be the act of a fool. Colonel Denham gave a sharp bark of laughter. That's just it, Pritchard. Familiarity breeds carelessness. You might have thought the tower safe because it was yours by right. Mrs. Denham shifted at his side, her head bent low, the faintest tremor in her hands. Miss Marple, glancing at her with apparent mildness, noticed how the woman pressed her lips together, as if to stifle words. Lucy, her face pale, spoke up suddenly. It wasn't Mr. Pritchard. I saw him outside before the service. He couldn't have gone up into the tower and back without being noticed. She glanced towards Tom, who nodded eagerly, though his own position was precarious. Graves regarded her with an unreadable expression. You are very certain, Miss Grant. Certainty is rare in these matters. Be cautious with it. He let the silence stretch before continuing. What interests me more is Mrs. Fletcher's fear. She withdrew money. She carried her cushion to the organ loft. She marked certain hymns in her book. These are not the actions of a woman at peace. Miss Marple looked down at her knitting, her needles moving in slow rhythm. Fear often leads one to prepare for something inevitable, she said gently. Mrs. Fletcher may have expected danger, but from whom? It must have been someone close enough that she could not avoid them, even in the sanctuary of the church. Graves gave her a sharp glance, as though her words touched too nearly on his own suspicions. He dismissed the group soon after, but not before instructing them all to remain in the village until further notice. That evening, the Green Dragon was louder than it had been in days. The villagers, restless with unease, sought comfort in shared speculation. Mr. Symes repeated his theory of money and legacies with growing confidence, while Mrs. Price Ridley whispered to Mrs. Beamish that Mrs. Denham's pale looks betrayed a guilty conscience. Tom Bartlett, determined to defend himself, grew reckless in his speech, insisting that someone of higher station must be to blame. His eyes darted toward the Colonel, whose face darkened ominously. Lucy tried in vain to hush him, her own cheeks burning with anxiety. Miss Marple listened without comment. She remembered the list of hymns, the faint crosses beside certain titles. There was something deliberate in those marks, something that hinted not at faith but at communication. She had copied them carefully, and now as she sipped her tea she recited them silently to herself. 3 in particular seemed to form a sequence, one of warning, one of resignation, and one of hope. They were not chosen at random. The following morning, a new discovery unsettled the village further. Dr. Forbes, called to examine Mrs. Fletcher's cottage once more, uncovered a half-burnt letter in the grate. Though much of it was lost, one phrase remained legible: "The debt must be paid." Graves read it aloud in the vestry with grim satisfaction. "This," he said, "proves she was being threatened. Someone in this village pressed her for money, and when she resisted, they killed her." The villagers who heard the news exchanged uneasy glances. Suspicion shifted again, settling heavily upon those most closely tied to her finances. Harold Pritchard protested his innocence more loudly than ever. The Denhams grew more silent, and Tom Bartlett muttered angrily about scapegoats. Miss Marple, walking home through the crisp air, thought of the letter and of debts that were not only financial. She remembered Mrs. Denham's trembling, her husband's bluster, and the way Mrs. Fletcher had spoken of starting afresh. There was a link there, faint but real, between fear, silence, and money that vanished too quickly. Human nature was written in those small gestures, far more clearly than in ledgers. That night Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting folded in her lap. She reviewed her notes once more. Powder on the ropes, money withdrawn, hymns marked, a cushion concealing a key, a burnt letter, and the hidden sum in the tower. The pieces fit together more snugly now, though one gap remained. She needed to know not only who had the motive and the means, but who had betrayed themselves in their smallest, unguarded moment. As she blew out her lamp, she thought of a maid in St. Mary Mead, who once dropped a glove while stealing sugar. It was not the theft itself, but the foolish carelessness that had betrayed her. Murderers, too, often revealed themselves not in the great act, but in the small oversight. And somewhere in Chipping Cleghorn, that oversight had already been made. It was only a matter of watching, listening, and waiting for the right moment to bring it into the light. Inspector Graves returned the next morning with a resolve that did not pass unnoticed. His manner was brisk, his questions sharper, and though he remained polite, there was little of patience left in his eyes. He had the look of a man closing a net, though he had not yet decided around whom it should draw. The villagers felt it instantly. Doors opened with more hesitation, shutters lingered longer closed, and conversations faltered as soon as his shadow fell across a threshold. Miss Marple, seated as always with her knitting at the ready, observed with her quiet detachment. She had lived long enough to know the danger of too much confidence, and though Graves pursued his case with admirable diligence, she sensed he had fixed his mind too firmly on the most obvious. Harold Pritchard, with his powder-stained hands and his flustered manner, had been pushed toward the centre of suspicion, and Tom Bartlett hovered near it as well. But Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Fletcher's marked hymns, of the hidden key of the pale, trembling hands of Mrs. Denham. She could not reconcile those small truths with the neatness of the inspector's theory. The day took a sudden turn when Sergeant Barker hurried to the Green Dragon with startling news. Another sum of the missing money had been discovered, this time not in the tower but hidden in the Denhams' garden shed, beneath a pile of firewood. The handkerchief around it bore no initials, but the discovery was enough to stir the village into a frenzy. Colonel Denham, when confronted, flew into a rage, denouncing the very idea as absurd, and vowing that someone had planted it there. His wife sat silent beside him, her face drained of color. The villagers, whispering behind their hands, were not convinced by the colonel's bluster. That evening the Green Dragon was packed, every face tense with speculation. Mr. Symes announced that the truth was plain enough at last: money, motive, opportunity. Mrs. Price Ridley added that she had often suspected the colonel of being too fond of managing other people's affairs, and this only confirmed her suspicions. Tom Bartlett, eager to divert attention from himself, declared that it was proof enough, though Lucy, pale with distress, begged him to hold his tongue. Mrs. Beamish served tea with the solemnity of a judge pronouncing sentence. Miss Marple, sipping her tea slowly, listened without comment. She watched Mrs. Denham's hands, still twisting her handkerchief into shreds, and she thought of a wife in St. Mary Mead long ago, who had borne her husband's sins in silence until the burden nearly broke her. Fear, she reflected, left deeper marks than anger. Inspector Graves, encouraged by the discovery in the shed, pressed his questioning further. He demanded of Colonel Denham how such a sum could have come to rest on his property, and whether he had ever had dealings with Mrs. Fletcher. The colonel denied it hotly, his words tumbling over one another in their haste. Yet his wife's silence hung heavier than his protestations. Graves watched her keenly, but she gave him nothing more than bowed head and white knuckles. That night Miss Marple sat by her fire considering the puzzle. The Denhams had money hidden on their property, yet Mrs. Fletcher had gone to the tower carrying her cushion, her hymns marked, her key concealed. Why? She had been preparing, not merely hiding. She had been afraid, yes, but not of Pritchard or Tom. Her fear was directed elsewhere, towards someone she could not avoid. Miss Marple thought again of the hymn, Jesu, grant me this, I pray, a hymn of endings, of release. Mrs. Fletcher had been preparing for a confrontation, not merely hoarding money. The next morning brought another ripple through the village. Inspector Graves announced that he would be making an arrest. The villagers gathered in small knots, speculating in low voices whether it would be Pritchard, Tom, or the colonel. But before any such step could be taken, Miss Marple appeared at the vicarage, asking for a quiet word with Graves. She carried her knitting bag as always, and her manner was gentle, almost apologetic. I would not presume. Inspector, she said, her voice low and steady, but I think perhaps you are overlooking something very small. And in such matters, it is often the very small that matters most. She reminded him of the powder, not only on the ropes but on Pritchard's lip and on the chair where he had sat. It shows habit, Inspector, nothing more. Bell-ringers have powdered their hands for generations. It is no proof of guilt. But the money, that is more curious. Money hidden in the tower, and then more hidden in the Denham's shed. A woman withdrawing large sums and concealing them in strange places. That is not the act of a thief, but of one being threatened. Graves frowned, but Miss Marple went on, her tone as mild as ever. Mrs. Fletcher feared someone near her, someone she could not escape. She marked her hymns as one might leave a message. Warning, resignation, hope. She gave Lucy the book as though to keep it safe, and the key in her cushion, hastily stitched. It was meant to protect her secret, not to hide her guilt. She was paying someone, Inspector, or preparing to, and I think Mrs. Denham knows more than she has yet dared to say. Graves regarded her in silence for a long moment, then nodded curtly. Very well, Miss Marple. We shall see. That evening in the vestry he brought the Denhams once more. The Colonel blustered as before, but this time Graves pressed Mrs. Denham gently, asking if she had ever spoken with Mrs. Fletcher about money. Her hands trembled, and at last with a sob she confessed that Mrs. Fletcher had discovered something about the Colonel's old debts dating back to his time abroad. She had threatened exposure unless repayment was made. Mrs. Denham had begged her husband to make it right, but he had refused, and Mrs. Fletcher had grown more insistent. The Colonel roared at his wife's words, but his fury was futile. Graves turned on him with sudden sharpness. "You confronted her in the tower, Colonel. You demanded the money back, and when she refused, you silenced her with the rope." The room fell into a hush so complete that even the ticking of the vestry clock was loud. Mrs. Denham wept softly into her hands. The Colonel's face purpled, then slackened as though the fight had gone from him. At last he muttered, "She left me no choice." Miss Marple, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, looked on with quiet sorrow. She had seen it before in different guises: pride curdling into ruin, a husband's sins borne too long by a silent wife, debts of money and of honor paid in blood. Murder was never glamorous, never clever. It was only human weakness, laid bare in its ugliest form. As the Colonel was led away, the villagers murmured in shock, their theories scattered like autumn leaves. Mrs. Denham sat slumped, her silence at last broken, but at a cost that could not be mended. Miss Marple rose gently, smoothing her skirt, and offered her a handkerchief. "You were very brave, my dear," she said softly. It is not easy to speak when one has been silent so long. Outside, the mist had lifted at last, and the bell tower stood stark against the evening sky. The bells remained silent, but the air seemed lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from the village itself. Miss Marple walked home at her usual unhurried pace, reflecting as she went that human nature was always the same, frailties and pride, fears and desires, weaving the same patterns over and over. And though she would never boast of it, she had learned long ago to see those patterns as clearly as the dropped stitches in her knitting. The village returned, as villages always do, to the outward signs of normal life. Curtains were drawn back, doors stood open once more, and the bells of St. Mary's, silent for so many days, rang out again on Sunday morning. Yet beneath the ordinary hum of life, there remained an echo of unease, the kind that lingers after tragedy has touched a place so small and so familiar. For Chipping Cleghorn had discovered, as Miss Marple well knew, that evil seldom arrives with a stranger's face. More often it dwells quietly within, hidden beneath the very manner of respectability. Colonel Denham had been taken away to face justice, his pride broken and his debts at last laid bare. His wife, pale and diminished, remained in the village. There was much whispering about whether she would stay on in the house or depart to live with distant relatives, but Miss Marple, visiting her with a basket of preserves, found her subdued but strangely at peace. "It is a terrible thing," Mrs. Denham said in a low voice, "but I no longer feel afraid. I had lived in fear for so long, Miss Marple. Now, whatever comes, I'm free of it." Miss Marple took her hand gently, knowing that release from fear, even when it arrives through sorrow, is a kind of deliverance. Harold Pritchard returned to his duties at the bell tower, though the villagers looked upon him with new respect for the steadfastness he had shown under suspicion. Lucy Grant and Tom Bartlett, their names at last cleared, walked together more openly, no longer whispering in shadows but strolling by the green with the innocence of youth. Mrs. Price Ridley declared that she had suspected the Colonel from the beginning, while Mr. Symes insisted that his theory about money had been correct in essence, if not in detail. Mrs. Beamish poured tea with a solemn air and reminded everyone that sin will out, which most found very comforting. As for Inspector Graves, he acknowledged Miss Marple with a brief inclination of the head before leaving the village. He had done his duty with diligence, yet he knew, as she knew, that it was her quiet observations, her gentle remarks about powder and hymn books, about trembling hands and silence kept too long, that had given shape to the truth. He was too proud to admit it openly, but he respected it all the same. On the afternoon after the Colonel's arrest, Miss Marple sat in her garden with her knitting. The sun was low, catching the roses in a warm glow, and the air carried the faint toll of the restored bells. She thought of Mrs. Fletcher, lonely, determined, fearful, and of how her preparations had been her undoing. She had sought to protect herself with hidden keys, marked hymns and secret cushions, but in the end it had been her knowledge of another's shame that sealed her fate. Murder, Miss Marple reflected quietly, is never born of mystery but of the simplest motives, fear of exposure, desire for money, wounded pride, and always it is betrayed by the smallest things. A powder mark, a hymn too carefully chosen, a hand that trembles when it ought to be still. Her needles clicked in steady rhythm as she worked the last row of a pattern. She considered how the village would go on, as villages always do, tucking away the memory of tragedy beneath the routines of market and church, of gossip and garden. Yet the echo would remain. They would look differently at the bell tower now, at the Colonel's once commanding figure, at the pale woman who had borne her silence so long. And perhaps in their own quiet ways they would think more carefully about the frailties of human nature, which are always closer than one wishes to believe. When the last stitch was cast off, Miss Marple laid her knitting neatly in her lap and smiled faintly. Justice, she thought, was not always tidy, but it was necessary. And in chipping Cleghorn, at least, the pattern had been set to rights once more. The bells tolled, the sun dipped behind the cottages, and Miss Marple, serene in her garden, reflected, as she always did, that the greatest mysteries are solved not with clever tricks, but with the clear-eyed knowledge of how very ordinary people behave when pressed by fear, temptation or pride. And with that she reached for her teacup. The matter of murder in the bell tower folded away like a finished piece of knitting, complete, inevitable, and very much a part of the tapestry of human life.